Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to remind you that Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believes that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a perfect death for your sins and for mine. If you would like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to go to the description of this video where you will find a link to a full gospel presentation as well as how to respond to the gospel and connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we want to invite you to join us for services both in person at 11 o'clock at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church or online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church in your area where you can have fellowship and worship with them. As we begin our study today, we are continuing on in our study of the book of Isaiah. We are in session 12 today, and in session 12, we are looking at Isaiah chapter 58, and we're going to be looking at that almost in its entirety. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 12, and the title of our time together today is God Expects. So again, we are in session 12. The title of that session is God Expects, and we are going to be in Isaiah chapter 58, looking at verses 1 through verse 12. As we get into our study today, we want to start once again with a question, and this is very much so kind of an open-ended question. This is a question that is kind of made to get you to have a discussion, which means there's not necessarily a right answer to this question. So we want you to write some things down, really kind of engage the question, as well as if you're watching this with other people, to really have that back and forth, to really have that discussion about where you stand on this issue. As we always do in our videos, as we ask questions, we're going to encourage you to pause the video, write some things down if you're by yourself, have a discussion with the people that you're watching with, if there are other people in the room with you, and then just whenever you're ready, go ahead and start that video up again, hit play again, and then we will continue on in our study. So here's the question that we want to start off with today. And we want to take a statement and we want to ask that whether you agree or disagree with this statement. And the statement is, all people are hypocrites. All people are hypocrites. Do you agree or do you disagree with that statement? And so take a couple minutes, pause the video, discuss that, and then give your reasons. Do you think, I think all people are hypocrites, and here is why. I don't think all people are hypocrites, and here is why. Have that discussion, and then whenever you're ready, go ahead and hit play again, and we'll continue on our study. All right, so hopefully you've had a couple minutes to discuss this, and we are going to be thinking about this today. And really what the book is going to really point to today is that the prophet Isaiah reveals God is always consistent and does not put up with spiritual hypocrisy from his people. Whether or not we categorize all humans as hypocrites or not, we can all agree that we fall short of God's expectations. In this session, we will see how God graciously reveals his expectations to his people, letting them know that they are falling short. So, when we look at that question, whether you fell on the yes, we are all hypocrites, or no, we are not, one thing we can say for sure is we know that God is not a hypocrite because he has a standard, he lives by that standard, and he is consistent in that in all ways. And no matter whether you think all people are hypocrites or not, we do have to acknowledge that we are sinful, fallen people, and we just don't get it right. We are very much so coming into the towards the end of the book of Isaiah. We've talked about different sections throughout this, and we're actually really transitioning out of one section into another. And if we talked about the previous section being one where God was kind of bringing about, he's talking about the Messiah, he's talking about what he's going to do and bring about peace and bring the people back to Israel. Now that we see kind of a shift in gears, and what Isaiah is going to do at this point is he is going to start saying, in light of the fact that I'm going to bring you back in, of what you are going to be restored as my covenant people, this is how you are supposed to live. So there's going to be very much so a call to, this is what you're doing wrong, this is what we want you to do right throughout our passage today. With that in mind, we're going to understand that the one true God is just and he expects his people to demonstrate their faith through right living. So that idea of through right living is going to be very significant in our passage today. And so let's get into our passage today. Let's look at Isaiah 58, and we're going to start in verses 1 through 5. And as we look at the passage today, I want you to listen for indications of the people's hypocrisy. So as we read these first 5 verses, think about what in this passage is showing us that the people were being hypocritical. So let's get into it. It says this: "Cry out loudly, don't hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Tell my people their transgressions and the house of Jacob their sins. They seek me day after day and delight to know my ways, like a nation that does what is right and does not abandon the justice of their God. They ask me for righteous judgments, and they delight in the nearness of God. Why have we fasted, but you have not seen? We have denied ourselves, and you haven't noticed. Look, you do as you please on the day of your fast, and oppress all your workers. You fast with contention and strife, to strike viciously with your fist. You cannot fast as you do today, hoping to make your voice heard on high. Will the fast I choose be like this: a day for a person to deny himself and to bow his head like a reed and to spread out his sackcloth and ashes? Will you call it a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord?" So as we get into this, we start looking at those indicators of their hypocrisy. And it's really found kind of in the heart of the passage when we look at verses, specifically verse 3. And in verse 3, it says, they ask this question: "Why have we fasted and you've not seen? We've denied ourselves and you've not noticed." There's an idea here that they are fasting and that they are denying themselves, that they're celebrating a fast or they're doing a fast because they want God to see them. And a lot of times, especially in this time period and in this region, there's an idea here of, when we're saying you didn't notice, you didn't see, it means you didn't do something. We were fasting for a reason, and you didn't act upon that reason. We wanted you to see what we were doing and do something, and you didn't do it. Essentially, they were wanting to manipulate God to bow to their wishes. They wanted God to see what they're doing and say, "Okay, I'll do stuff for you," when in reality, that was never the purpose of fasting to begin with. The purpose of fasting was to deny yourself worldly things like food and sleep and whatever it might be, to accentuate and to remind yourself that you were fully dependent on God, that you had put your faith and your trust in God. Even that first part of the passage where it sounds like he's complimenting him when he's saying things that you seek me day after day, you delight in my ways, you are like a nation that does what is right. This is almost, in a sense, sarcasm. This is God saying, listen, you're not a nation. Quite literally says you're not a nation that does what is right and doesn't abandon justice for God, but you're like one who does, which means on the outside, the nation of Israel, that they looked like they were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. On the outside, they looked like a holy nation. They looked like a nation that pursued the Lord. But in reality, all of their outward appearance was just a show, and inwardly, they were just doing it to get what they wanted. With that in mind, we have to ask ourselves, as we talk about worship and how we relate to God, can someone be worshiping hypocritically? And even more so, can someone be worshiping hypocritically and not know it? And let's just take a pause on that question for a second. Can you be worshiping God and doing so in a hypocritical manner and not know it? I would say yes. I would say you absolutely can. And one of the things that we always have to kind of remember when it comes to sin and when it comes to our relationship with the Lord is that sin is horribly, ridiculously self-deceiving. And that often people think that their relationship with the Lord is really in good shape and that they have a great relationship with God. In reality, they're not. Their heart is far from them. They have huge blind spots in their life where they're not pursuing God, where they're just all about themselves, where they're pursuing their own wants and their own desires. And there's just a lot of times, and I would even have to lump myself into this, where there's been times in my life where I thought I was being a great Christian, or I thought I was being, I was walking with the Lord, and then looking back, I realized that there were areas in my life that I was, in rebellion towards God, and that I refused to allow God to be a part of that. And I'll be honest with you, there's probably areas in your life where you're that way as well. And it may be big, noticeable areas where everybody sees it, but it may also be small areas. It may be things where nobody sees it, but you still hold on to things and you're in rebellion towards God. We recognize that there is a relationship between our heart and our actions, and also what we do, that they must all be in alignment. The book brings up James chapter 2, and James chapter 2, starting in verse 14, it says this. It says, "What use is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can this faith save him? A brother or sister without clothing and is in need of daily food, and the one of you says to him, 'Go in peace and be warmed and be filled,' yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body. What use is that? In the same way also, if you have no works, it is dead, being by itself." And so we see, even in works, if we have works without faith, it's worthless. If we have faith that does not translate to life transformation and all those things working together, then it's just as worthless. And what we see from Israel during this time is they were performing the rituals, they were celebrating the holidays, they were doing these things that they were supposed to be doing, when in reality, they were only doing them because they wanted the benefit of a relationship with God. They didn't actually want the relationship with God. And so I think it's good for us to ask ourselves, are we that same way? And I think it's good that that God really through Isaiah just brings forth this reality that says, listen, you think you're a holy nation, you think you're doing everything right, but you're not. You're not doing everything right. In fact, you're acting like one, but in reality, you're just wanting me to see, and you're wanting to get things from me. And sometimes we really need to have that same gut check in our life. We need to have God step in and say, listen, I know you think you're walking with me, but there's areas of your life where you're not, and you need to know about it. And sometimes God puts people in our lives to make that abundantly apparent. So here's a question for you to pause the video and to have a discussion about, and it's this. There's a couple questions here. It's why is it important for Isaiah to define the reality? What were the dangers of failing to give them the accurate picture of what was happening? So why was it important that Isaiah spoke to them honestly and said, listen, you are acting like you're in line with God, when in reality you're not? Why is that important? That they understand where they're at. And then a follow-up to that is, why are insincere acts of worship offensive to God? And how does ritual worship apart from obedience leave worshipers empty and disillusioned? So why was it important that Isaiah confronted them with this and brought about the reality and really showed them where they stood? And then why is it that the insincere acts of worship, that ritualism is actually even offensive to God and leaves worshipers empty and disillusioned? Pause the video, have that discussion, and we will return in a few minutes to go on to our next section. All right, as we continue on in our study, let's look at verses 6 through 10. And as we do so, I want to challenge you to pay attention to how Isaiah defines worship, how he defines true worship in this passage. This is what he says. "Isn't this the fast I choose? To break the chains of wickedness, to untie the ropes of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to tear off every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see them, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood? Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will be quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. And at that time, when you call the Lord, he will answer. When you cry out, he will say, 'Here I am.' And if you will get rid of the yoke among you, and the finger pointing, and the malicious speaking, and if you offer yourselves to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted one, then your light will shine in the darkness, and your night will be as noonday." So we have a very different idea of what worship is from God's perspective. And so really what he's saying is, listen, you're fasting and you're doing these things and you're calling it worship. When in reality, even while you're doing these things, you're only doing it because you want something. And while you're doing it, you're still doing other wicked things. You're oppressing your neighbor. You're acting horribly. He talks about using malicious speak and pointing fingers at people and blaming. It talks about oppressing other people and striking people and hitting them and striking them and doing violence to other people, even your own. We talks about your own flesh and blood. He's talking about your kinsmen, even to your own kinsmen, other Israelites. He says, listen, well, you claim to be worshiping me, you claim to be following me, but then you do all of these other things that make it so abundantly clear that you do not. We see in this passage that true worship goes beyond just the rituals and the fast, and then instead it is a command to serve others. That we, it's that command to serve others, and it's a command that we see throughout all of Scripture. If we go to the New Testament, we can go to Matthew 22, and starting in verse 36, it says this: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment of them all?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and the foremost commandment. The second one is like it, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets." God is saying in both Isaiah 58 and in Matthew 22 that proper worship of God has to include and really encapsulate also this love for your neighbor, this love for other people. It is crucial that they come together. A question the book asks that I think we can discuss together is this: how can we love God without loving others? And can we love others without loving God? Is there, we even look at those two greatest commandments from Matthew 22. Can you really do one without the other? Can you love God and yet not love your neighbors? Or can you love your neighbors and yet not love God? And I would present to you today, no, you can't. First off, 1 John makes it abundantly clear when John himself says, how is it that you can say that you love God whom you've not seen, but then in turn hate your brother who you have seen? He says you can't do it. He says that if you hate your brother, then the love of God is not in you. That literally that love that we are supposed to have that we get from God and for God just cannot be present. And so to love God and to love God rightly, and it just inherently is going to bleed over and has to include a love for other people. And then with that, if we try to flip that, well, can you love people without loving God? And I'm going to kind of give a weird answer, and that's not very well. We really can't love people very well apart from a right relationship with the Lord. I know that there are people out there that don't believe in God, that do believe in love and romance and are quite charitable, good, wonderful people. I know that exists, but the reality is that the love that God has given us, the love that God has bestowed upon us, the love that God has filled us with and intends for us to pay forward, to pass on to other people, that is the best God-given perfect love that exists. And so ultimately, if we try to love other people without loving God first, is we are going to present them with a love that will eventually kind of rear its selfishness, will eventually fall short, will eventually become twisted into something it's not supposed to be. That's why when we talk about marriage, and if you've ever done marriage counseling with me, or you've ever talked about what God's heart and desire is for marriage, that's why when we talk about marriage, we try to found all of that and put as a foundation of every marriage is the relationship that both of them have with Jesus Christ. Because when a husband or a wife loves the Lord, they are inherently going to love their partner better. There's just no question about it. In verses 8 and 10, as we focus in on that, we'll notice that these verses lay out a promise of reward for right living and describe the direct results of right living. Let's look at these two verses right now, verses 8 through 10, and it says this: "Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. At that time you will call, and the Lord will answer. When you cry out, he will say, 'Here I am.' And if you get rid of the yoke among you and the finger pointing and the malicious speaking, if you offer yourself to the hungry, satisfy the afflicted one, then your light will shine in the darkness, and your night will be like noonday." We have to acknowledge that from these, first off, we see restoration, that God is going to heal them, God is going to restore them, God is going to make them like new. Beyond that, we see protection, that God is going to be their rear guard and that he's going to take care of them. And then lastly, we even see in that last thing is that then they will do what God created them to do. They will be that light. They will be that city on the hill, and they will be the people who point the nations to a relationship with the Lord. That if they will care for other people and if they will love people well and they will live for God, that they will become a witness and an ambassador for God among the nations, and people will see the glory of God through this people. Wonderful, wonderful thing. Isaiah describes true fasting as caring for others. So here's a question for you guys. We want you to pause the video and have a conversation about this and think about it. It says this: does God still care about physical fasting and other rituals? And what about baptism in the Lord's Supper? So this is, again, kind of an open-ended question for you to discuss. And if he's talking about true fasting, this passage is really caring for other people, relieving the freeing and releasing the oppressed, helping the hungry, the tired, the poor, the naked, the homeless, all that stuff. If this is what he says is true worship and true fasting, then what does that translate to us in our rituals and maybe even our ordinances like baptism and the Lord's Supper? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll come back and discuss it as well. All right, so when we start asking about these questions, it's going to be very easy for someone to look at a passage like this and kind of come back at it and say something along the lines of, well, a passage like this is saying that we shouldn't have any traditions, we shouldn't do anything like that. And then that begins to get a little bit dangerous, because then what do you do with baptism? What do you do with the Lord's Supper? What do you do with church membership? What do you do with candlelight services and Easter celebrations and Palm Sundays and all those other type of things? And the reality is not that there's anything wrong with fasting. This was not intended, even at this time, to be the abolishment of fasting. In fact, fasting is something that carries over into the New Testament. Jesus himself, when he went out into the wilderness, he fasted. The important thing is that we do so with the right heart and with the right intentions. The truth is that everything we do, even the baptism and the Lord's Supper, can be done wrongly. When we get baptized just because our friend got baptized, or we get baptized just because that's what all of the people in the youth group are doing at that time, that's for the wrong reason. If we do it to get our parents off of our back, that's for a wrong reason. If we do it because we want to impress a girl or a boy or whatever, then that's for the wrong reason. If we celebrate the Lord's Supper and yet we're angry and at animosity with our brothers and sisters in Christ, and we're upset with people, then we're doing it for the wrong reason. If we're celebrating the Lord's Supper and we've really not even for a moment have reflected on our life and the fact that we're saved by grace and we're just doing it because it's there and available, then we're doing it for the wrong reason. If we just do it because it's a date on the calendar and we do it that many days a year and that's the only thought we put into it, then we're doing it for the wrong reason. But we need to approach every tradition that we have and every ordinance that we have, like, things like baptism and Lord's Supper. Those are the two ordinances. We need to do so within a right heart position. We need to come to the Lord and say, I am a sinner saved by grace. I'm coming to get baptized because I believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that I want to make that public, and I want to make that known, and I want to begin this new life as a disciple of Jesus Christ. When we come to the Lord's table for communion, we need to come with the idea that we are reflecting on the sacrifice that God made on our behalf as sinners, and looking forward to the day that he is going to return, and that we are going to celebrate the marriage feast in a new heaven and a new earth in New Jerusalem. We need to actually think about these things. We need to make sure that these are times where we have our hearts in a posture of worship, that we don't do it just because that's what we're doing, but we do it for the right reasons and the right thoughts. It doesn't mean we get rid of them, but it doesn't mean we don't think about them either. Let's close out our time together. We're going to look at verses 11 and 12 and talk about those for just a minute, and then I'll have one final question for you guys to close out our time together. 11 and 12 says this: "The Lord will always lead you, satisfy you in a parched land, and strengthen your bones. You will be like a watered garden, like a spring whose water never runs dry. Some of you will rebuild the ancient ruins, and you will restore the foundations laid long ago. You will be called the repairer of broken walls, the restorer of streets where people live. As we look in this passage, we have to recognize that that the imagery given here would have resonated a great deal with the listeners. That they lived in a fairly desert climate. They were used to treating water as a precious commodity, and he speaks of water being ample and abundant, of you being renewed and restored because of this. It's a reason why Jesus in the New Testament talks about living water, and that the water that he would give the woman at the well would be living water that would create a well in her body, that she would never thirst again. These were important images for these people. And not only is there an idea of water, and thus with that comes care and sustenance and provision and all of your needs being met, but also this idea of restoration, with walls being built, foundations being laid, that they are going to see their world and their people restored. Ultimately, we get this idea that God is going to set all things right. And they may have read this as the idea that those that would be in exile would return to Jerusalem, that would return to Israel, and that Israel would be reestablished and be safe and secure. But we know this to mean far more than that. And that in reality, this passage is pointing to the day where Christ will come and he will set all things right, and that sin will be no more, that death will be no more. And as Revelation 21 says, that God will say, who's seated on the throne will say, "Behold, I am making all things new." As we close out our time together, I want to leave you with this question. You can the video will close out, discuss this question, pray, and then join us for worship at 11, either at Facebook Live or in person. The last question is this: how do these verses demonstrate how God can change a life or situation in ruins into something beautiful? So as we look at these last two verses, we see how God is going to turn things around, that he is going to flip things and make them good. And so the question to you is, how do you see this in your own life? And how do you see this even today, that God can take something that is broken, something that is in ruins, and he can turn it into something beautiful? So take a couple minutes, discuss that, have prayer, either with, there in your home or with your family, have prayer, and then join us for worship at 11 o'clock. We will be online through Facebook Live, and then that will be on YouTube shortly thereafter, or you can join us in person at 11 o'clock. We want to encourage you to follow all social distancing and masking, all the things that you need to do while you're here. We want to be very cautious and careful about this virus and not do anything to spread it. If you feel like you are at risk, or that you have regularly have close contact with someone that is at risk, we would strongly encourage you to stay home and watch online. Otherwise, no matter how we see you, we look forward to worshiping with you. Thank you so much, and God bless.